To keep things simple at this point, I'm going to start by creating the photographer page instead of creating this front page, which has some added complexities in aligning these 3 columns side by side. So we're going to first create this About page, which is a little simpler structure, just a series of divs with some basic CSS formatting to control how things appear. I'm going to do that by creating a completely new site. So the first thing I'll do is close this site. And now I want to create a new website. Remember, a one-page site really just starts with one blank page. An empty site starts with nothing, but you can always add more pages to a one-page site. So this is a fine way to start. We want to give this a name. Expression Web will automatically generate a name based on whatever the last name was that you used for a website. I'm going to keep the Nature Photographer because this is another version of that site, but I'm going to call this -04 so that I can distinguish that this is for chapter 4 and I can keep track of which version of this website I'm using. We'll be using many versions of this site in this series, so naming it according to the chapter will help us all keep track later. You also have a choice of saving this in the My Websites folder or browsing to choose a different folder. I'm just going to leave it in My Websites for now. Click OK. And you see Expression Web has automatically created a default.html file. Double-click and you open your new blank file. Remember that Expression Web always calls the main page of a website default.html. You may need to change that to index.html depending on your service provider, but for the most part, default.html should always be your home page. And also remember, you can name the rest of the files and folders in your site anything you like, but it's best not to use spaces or special characters. No punctuation marks, no empty spaces, but you can use the dash or the underscore if you want to include a little space in your naming. The first step to recreating the CSS layout that we saw when we previewed this page in a browser and turned off the styles is to create a series of divs that will contain the content in our site. Now, divs can be a little confusing at first, but essentially a div is just an HTML tag that creates a simple little box. And it's such a popular common tag that Expression Web includes it right here at the top of the tags list in the toolbox. So if you want to add a div to this page, you can simply click and drag to bring it into the page. And as you see here, the div is really just an empty box. And it's used to contain content and to separate sections of content from one another. And by organizing our content in divs, we can then position sections of content in different ways by creating styles that are applied to those divs. So the div is an HTML tag, but we're going to use CSS styles to control how and where this div appears. Now the first trick here is that we need to create a series of 4 divs, and we want those to be contained inside a 5th div that will act as the overall boundary of our page design. Remember, because this is a fixed width design that we want to center on the page, we're going to need one div around the outside of everything that contains all of our content. So there are a couple ways to do this. Once you've added one div, you can click and drag another div into the middle of it. And this is a good time to point out this little breadcrumb trail at the top of the screen. So now you can see there's a div inside a div. But notice here in the workspace, it's very hard to tell that there are actually 2 divs here. Because one is inside the other and they're essentially just empty boxes, there's not much to show us that there are 2 divs here. And although we want a series of divs inside one div, we don't want each inside the other. If I keep dragging divs inside here, what I'm really doing is putting this div inside this div inside this div. If I split the screen, you can better see what's happening. And in general, especially when I'm working with div tags that are empty like this, I keep the program set to split view so I can see what's happening behind the scenes. Here you see a div tag with 2 other div tags nested inside it. But what I really want are 4 div tags not nested within each other, just nested within the top one. Now, if you're familiar with code and you prefer, you can do some cut and paste or copy and paste. So just cut that out, add a return, paste, and you see now I have 2 divs side by side inside that. And now they do split apart here in design area because one is below the other and both are inside the 3rd div. By the way, spaces in HTML code like this really don't matter. Any spacing that you do here is for your own benefit. So if it's easier for you to understand the code by adding some returns and some spacing, that's a good way to organize your code. But don't worry, spaces and returns in the HTML code won't actually affect how content is displayed in the page. To add spaces in HTML, you need other tags, like the P tag for paragraph marks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now we're creating a series of divs inside a div. And if we wanted 4 divs inside that 5th div, we could continue to copy and paste. Again, cleaning up the spacing if we want to make it look better for us. And now you'll see there are 4 divs on the page here with a 5th div around them. And it can be tricky to select divs, which is why I'll often come back to the breadcrumbs here when I'm trying to select divs. So like I said, if you're familiar with code or you like working in code, an easy way to set this up is just to use copy and paste, and using split view, make sure that you've set this up properly. But if you're like most people who are new to web design or designers who prefer not to work in code, let me show you an easier way to do this without having to worry about the HTML. So let's just delete that. Notice there's absolutely nothing left on this page. And now instead of dragging a div into the page and then dragging another div inside it, I'm going to drag a series of divs one after another. Notice that I'm getting my cursor down below that first div. So what I'm going to do is just create these 4 divs, one on top of another. And now the goal is to have a 5th div around these. So another way to do that is to click and drag to select them. And here's a tip. Even though they don't look selected in Design View, Expression Web has selected all of my divs, and I can tell that here in Code View. Now if I right-click on the div tag, I now have a new option, Wrap. And you can see that I can add a div around the existing divs by using that Wrap feature. Now, Wrap comes in handy in lots of places because many times you'll have already created several divs or already added a number of things to the page and then decide you need to add another div around them to control the positioning. So being able to wrap a div around selected elements can be very handy. So I can double check here in the code and you can see I have one div that surrounds 4 other divs. And this is what I need to create the basic structure of my page. I've got one for the top of my page where I'll put that banner, one for the navigation elements at the top, a main content div, which is where I'll put the biography and the photo, and a footer div, which is where I'll repeat those navigation links. Now in this design there was one other extra div at the very bottom. And this is a little tricky, but I'm going to add a div at the very bottom of this structure outside of the other divs. And that's going to serve as a place for my copyright information. The reason I'm doing that is because I want that copyright to look like it kind of floats at the very bottom of the page, and I want it to be set against the background color of the page itself, not against the white background that I'll have in the main design area. I think as we go through creating the styles for each of these, it'll start to make more sense. But the first step to creating a layout like this is creating a series of divs and getting them in the order and structure that you want. And I hope that helps you create those a little more precisely, because if you don't get those divs lined up properly, nothing else will work right later. So let's go ahead and save this page, and let's get out of Design View so we don't have to look at that anymore. And now let me just bring my cursor up here to this very top div to get ready to add some images to this page.